Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, gang. So only the one video this week because you get your midterm exam. You get to take your midterm exam on Thursday. So Thursday at about 8:30 in the morning, maybe slightly before that, I will be sending you guys your midterm exam via the UR courses email. Don't forget, in your email, you should already have the potential terms for this upcoming week's exam. So, all right. So this is where we are on the calendar. We've just finished week 6. All the annotated bibliographies should be that I've received on time should be done. I'm grading another class right now. Once I get that done, I'll get caught up with the others and do the midterms. And oh dear God, there's a lot of grading. So we are heading into week 7. First and foremost, happy Thanksgiving. Take the day off, enjoy yourself. Don't study too much. For me, this is where the magic happens. I.e. the kitchen. Yay, food! So we are, to give you guys an idea, week 7 midterm exam. You guys should be starting to read the Hassel book. At the very least, read a little bit, take some notes, read a little bit, take some notes. Don't wait until the last second to do it. You will stress yourself stuff out. And we don't want anybody stressed out. So try to keep that workplace balance. If you do things a little bit at a time, that'll make it easier for you. Trust me on this. That is due week 10, the 5th of November. So you'll have a bit of a gap, 2 weeks where there's nothing due. Don't wait until the last second to do it. Just don't. All right, so I want that one. Let us get started. All right, from current slide. So as always, key terms, hard words we start with all are eligible for the midterm exam. So getting to what we were talking about. So today, last video, I should say, not today. Last video, we talked about Cortez taking over, conquering the Aztec Empire. Let's establish New Spain. Let's talk about colonial Mexico. So we're going to establish New Spain, talk a little bit about how the Spaniards set everything up. We're going to talk about this series of reforms called the Bourbon Reforms in the 18th century, the 1700s. And then we're going to end this video talking about the Spanish missions. All right. So after Cortez officially took over Tenochtitlan in August 1521, Cortez immediately set about establishing the Spanish colony of New Spain. Tenochtitlan had large portions of the city destroyed in the siege by the Spaniards. So Cortez allowed his allies, the Tlaxcala, to build a fortress within the city and then razed the rest of it to the ground. Cortez rebuilt the city, christening it Mexico City, and keeping with the Aztec layout, simply tore down large parts of the Aztec architecture and replaced it with Spanish. For example, he replaced Aztec temples with Catholic churches. Now, King Charles I of Spain appointed Cortez as governor, captain general, and chief justice of the new territory. In other words, as governor, captain general, and chief justice, he had the legislative, judicial, and executive powers all in his hands. And for the next 3 years, from 1521 to 1524, Cortez ran the remnants of the Aztec Empire as his own personal fief, as his own personal colony, and went about implanting Spanish society into the region. Priests were sent all over to start the conversion process. The encomienda system was established. The indigenous peoples were brought under Spanish control by hook or by crook, and other Spanish towns were founded. Now, that's not to say that Charles was completely trusting of Cortez. Remember, this is a man who took off, who began his conquest of New Spain as a mutineer. So King Charles I appointed a small council to assist Cortez in the administration of the colony in 1521. The king basically said, look, you're taking over a large amount of territory. I'm sending you a small council in order to help you administer this territory. Well, that's only their official reason. Unofficially, they were sent there to keep an eye on Cortez. Now, Cortez, as we talked about last time, kind of an adventurous spirit, to say the least. So he kind of got bored with administering, and so in 1524, Cortez will step down and resume his career as a conquistador. But Spanish society, Spanish politics, Spanish economics, Spanish religion kept getting implanted into New Spain. The first audiencia was established in Mexico City in 1527, and the Viceroyalty of New Spain, the political entity of New Spain, was created in 1532. And this gentleman over here, Antonio de Mendoza, would be appointed the first Viceroy of New Spain with creation in 1532, although it takes him a little while to get there. He won't arrive in Mexico City until 1535. So Antonio de Mendoza arrives 1535 and becomes a Viceroy of New Spain. Now, the relationship between the Audiencia and the Viceroy was a little different than what you would find in Peru or the Caribbean colonies. The position of Viceroy would exercise most of the executive powers, execution of the laws, helping to run the day-to-day operations, while the Audiencia would serve almost as a combination of a legislative and deliberative function. It is almost one of the first examples of split government for the Europeans in the New World. Now, Mendoza, arriving in 1535, would serve as Viceroy of New Spain for 15 years, so 1535 to 1550, longer than any of his successors, and Mendoza would be the man most responsible for establishing New Spain as a viable colony. Mendoza, for example, would expand the mining and the farming that would ensure the financial stability for Spanish landholders in New Spain. Mendoza would authorize continued exploration and continued conquest of northern and western Mexico, and indeed sent the first Spanish expedition across the Pacific to the Philippines. So, for example, here we had the Coronado expedition for 2 years, 1540 to 1542, authorized by Mendoza, coming all the way from Spain up the modern day states of Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, all the way up to Kansas. So I mean, these are large undertakings. In New Spain itself, Mendoza established two institutes of higher learning: the Colegio de Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco and the Royal Pontifical University of New Spain. The Colegio de Santa Cruz, founded in 1536, the Royal Pontifical, founded in 1552. So first, the Colegio de Santa Cruz. The Colegio de Santa Cruz is the oldest European school of higher learning in the Americas. Its initial purpose, the initial purpose of the school, was to educate an indigenous priesthood and educate the children of Aztec nobility. These children would be taught Latin, Spanish, rhetoric, logic, music, a typical European curriculum. And the idea was to educate these children, make them more European, and then introduce them to the bureaucracy to get them leading, to get them in charge of the indigenous population, to bring them more under Spanish control. Now, the other one was the Royal Pontifical University of New Spain. Now, the Royal Pontifical operated between 1552 and 1867. It was shut down, burned down in 1867. The school was based off the model of the University of Salamanca in Spain. The Royal Pontifical was a European-only school, although some mestizos were allowed. The Royal Pontifical educated young men and trained them to be the administrators and the bureaucrats of New Spain. So the Colegio focused on the indigenous population, trying to get them more closely in line with Spanish rule. The Royal Pontifical was established to try to have a local bureaucracy of a local Creole bureaucracy, rather than always sending people in from Spain, a homegrown bureaucracy. Mendoza would further order the first printing press to be brought to Mexico in 1539, and the first book, The Ladder of Divine Ascent, was published in 1541. So this initial book was based on this idea of a social, a ladder, a social structure, easy for me to say, a social structure based on a ladder sort of analogy, where the rung you're born on is the rung you'll live, is the rung you'll die. If you're born a carpenter, you'll learn the carpenter trade, you'll die a carpenter, your son will become a carpenter. You are stuck on your social rung. And so both the creation of educational institutions and publications would feed into the growing religious aspect of the Spanish colonizing mission. So just a bit of a rundown of bringing Spanish politics, economics, religion, and society into New Spain. Let's talk next about the Bourbon Reform. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit. We're jumping from the 16th century to the 18th century, the 1500s to the 1700s. And the Bourbon Reforms will be a series of reforms taking place between 1750 and 1800. And this was a series of reforms instituted and designed to address some of the growing problems in the Spanish Empire. So this wasn't just specific to Spain, but rather empire-wide reforms. And they, as the PowerPoint suggests, dealt with administrative problems, economic problems, military, secular problems. And so let's look at the administrative reforms first. And so the administrative reforms, I'll get back to that in a second. The administrative reforms, the Bourbon reforms, will take power away from the Council of the Indies and place the administration of the colonies under a royal ministry. So now you will have more direct royal control over the sprawling colonies of Spain. And so the Council of the Indies was taken and brought under this royal ministry. But one of the things that the Bourbon reforms did specifically with New Spain was the creation of intendencias. Now, what's an intendencia? You might say, well, I'm glad you asked that question, student I cannot see right now. Well, an intendencia was an administrative unit under the viceroy in New Spain. This was each intendencia was headed by an intendente. intendencias, intendente. Whoop, there we go. Now, these administrative units could include more than one province and reported directly to the crown. So, for example, here, Viceroyalty of New Spain. This is the last 40 years. So you would have the Intendencia of Durango, the province of Texas, the Intendencia of Merida, there we go, Intendencia of Mexico, so on and so forth. Headed by intendentes, again, these administrative units could include more than one province and reported directly to the crown. So kind of bypassing, in a way, the viceroy. Pardon me, I'm just taking a drink. Now the intendentes, the leader of the intendencia, had the responsibility to oversee the treasury in his region, to collect taxes. I mean, you got to keep bringing in the money, and to promote the economic and agricultural growth of the region. So the viceroy overall big picture, intendentes focused on his own little area. Now the Spanish crown conceived the role of the intendentes as to be a royal check, a way to try to balance the growing powers of local officials, trying to make sure that viceroys don't become too powerful. Economically, in 1778, we have the Decree of Free Trade. Because if you remember, prior to the Decree of Free Trade, all the trade had to, yes, that works, had to basically go to Havana, Cuba, and from Havana, Cuba, then to Spain. The Decree of Free Trade in 1778 opened up the Spanish colonial trade network. And with the Decree of Free Trade, trade could flow from any port. It could flow to Panama, Veracruz, Havana, Santo Domingo, wherever. And this was designed to try to limit, try to tape down incidents of smuggling, where because everything had to go to one port and had to come from one port, people were trading with the French, trading with the English, trading with the Dutch to get goods that they need. Now, with the Decree of Free Trade, you could get goods from from other Spanish colonies. So goods like, let's say, Mexico might want sugar. But to get sugar, it would have to get it from Cuba, who would have to get it from Hispaniola, let's say. Now with the Decree of Free Trade, Mexico can just directly trade with Hispaniola, do not have to go through the middleman. Now there were continued issues of smuggling. Anything not transported on a Spanish ship was considered to be smuggling. But this decree had a more beneficial effect on New Spain than it hurt. In addition, another economic reform was expanding state monopolies with respect to cash crops and mining. In particular, you had tobacco production expanding to meet the needs of a growing consumer base. Who knew? You grow an addictive substance and you have an expanding consumer base. Who knew? And so tax incentives were there to push more trade, more growing of cash crops, sugar, tobacco, but tax incentives to promote the mining industry as well. Militarily, prior to the Bourbon reforms, well, the military in the New World was barely enough to keep up with the defense and order of the colony. The Bourbon reforms ensured that each colony, and indeed each intendencia, had a trained militia that could be called up to fight if need be. These militia were often racially segregated, with a separate Creole or Peninsulare, that is white militia, and a separate mestizo or mulatto, African, black, brown militia. However, in almost every militia, the commanders were Spanish born and Spanish trained, whereas the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants, the corporals, often were Creole, native, white Europeans born in the New World, born. Now, prior to this reform, basically Cuba was on its own, Hispaniola was on its own, Mexico was on its own, and the armed forces were barely enough to keep order in the colony. So if and when England, for example, decided, hey, we want to take Jamaica, they could basically walk in. This reform was designed to try to retain control of the colonies. And then we have secular reform. The Bourbon reforms attempted to diminish the power of the church within the colonial society. Whereas before these reforms, large numbers of colonial officials came from the ranks of the church. The Bourbons focused on appointing more officials from the ranks of the military and the ranks of the nobility, both Creole and Peninsulare. So they're trying to take some power away from the church and give it to the secular or the state level. So again, with the decree of free trade, goods coming from Santiago had to go up to Panama, which had to go up to Havana. So if San Francisco, for example, wanted something from Peru, they would literally have to get it from Havana and hope that they have it. Whereas with the decree of free trade now, you could trade directly between, say, San Francisco and Santiago. This is, by the way, what the Spanish Empire looked like circa 1780. We would have the Viceroyalty of Peru, that would be Upper and Lower Peru. Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, so think Argentina, Bolivia, etc. Viceroyalty of New Granada, so taking Tierra Firme and Castillo del Oro, combining them into Viceroyalty. Cuba, Hispaniola would continue to have their own government. Viceroyalty of New Spain, and then Louisiana. We're going to spend a week talking specifically how Louisiana goes from French to Spanish to Americans and the result thereof. So I mentioned secularization. So let's talk about Spain and religion. In particular, we're going to look at Spanish missions because the church will play an important role in the colonizing of New Spain. The church will often act as advance agents of Spanish settlers. And so you have different, not so much denominations, but different factions in the Catholic Church. The Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Jesuits, all establishing missions, basically small settlements designed to attract converts. So the Dominicans, Franciscans, the Jesuits, all establishing missions within New Spain in their race to try to convert the indigenous people of the Americas. Because remember, in this would have been 4 videos ago, when we were talking about the division between Spain and Portugal with respect to territory. In one of the papal bulls, the Sublimis Dei. Sorry, it took me a second to remember. Part of the papal bull basically said it is your job to go out and convert people. And so the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, all are part of that mission. And again, these missions would be spread out throughout most of what is today the southern United States and northern Mexico. St. Augustine, Florida, for example, started out as a Jesuit mission in 1565. Now, the Franciscans tended, I'm going to go back to this map for a second. The Franciscans tended to focus in what is modern day California, so northern and southern California, including the Baja Peninsula, as well as areas around New Mexico. The Jesuits tended to have their missions along the southeast, as well as the Sonoran Desert, while there was competition between the two in Texas. Now, the goal of these missions were to establish a permanent location where they could draw potential converts. These missions would also be ready-made areas whereby Spanish settlers could grow and settle around the mission. San Francisco, for example, started as a mission in Northern California before adding a presidio, a military fort, and growing in size from there. Now, the downside of these missions, the downside of these permanent locations, was that they remained targets for angry groups of indigenous people, so the missionaries had to maintain a delicate balance between its religious, let's convert everybody, and its secular missions. Let's not get killed. Let's have a city grow up around us. And so here we have on the left, we can sort of see how these missions are kind of similar architecturally, but also how they're different. On the left here, we have a mission from Florida. On the right, we have a mission from Texas. So built in the same style, the same type of windows, leading up to with the building leading up roof-wise towards the cross. We don't find as many missions in Florida and those areas as we do in Texas and more dry climates, simply because of the changing climates. Dry climates tend to not overtake architecture as willingly as wet ones. So here we have an example of a Spanish mission. This is a mission in Santa Ynez. And so we have the Indian living quarters. This would be where converted members of the indigenous population would live. They would live separate from the priests, who would have their living quarters inside the Spanish mission. Shared granary. The indigenous population would have their reservoir, while the mission would have its own. Within the mission itself, they would have workshops. They would have tanneries, blacksmith, stables with a corral in back with a hay barn, the main church, I mentioned the living quarters already, and the cemetery in the back. If you have ever played Red Dead Redemption 2, I think that's what I'm thinking of. Not the one where you play, well, the one where you play as John Marston, but as well its sequel. You will come across Spanish missions, and I have to say, I believe that the makers of Red Dead Redemption, whose name is escaping me for the second, did a fairly accurate representation of what a Spanish mission would look like. All right, so I am going to stop there. I said I would give you guys a shorter video for this week because you have your midterm on Thursday. So at or around 8:30 in the morning. On Thursday, I will be sending you your midterm exam on UR courses. You will have from 8:30 to 9:45 to complete it. Submit it via UR courses. Do not email me. Do not uh, email me your midterm exam. Submit it via UR courses on the link provided. Again, just to show you guys, basically just like the annotated bibliography, submit it via the midterm exam. Do not forget to click the submit button. You know who I'm talking to out there. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. Go have a happy Thanksgiving, or I hope you had a happy Thanksgiving. Go forth, slay dragons, and I will see you guys on the interwebs. All right, bye.